Hey, welcome back. So hopefully now you're all primed and ready to take a look at some examples of work in the recent literature which highlight the role of nuclear physics. Okay, so just a quick reminder, this is a snapshot from that movie that we watched, which showed explicitly all of the different nuclei that we were synthesizing in our process calculation, as well as the interaction that they were dominantly undergoing at a given point in time. So this is just to serve as a reminder that there are many different interactions that we have to consider within an R process calculation. There's a lot of nuclear data needs for the R process is another way of saying that. And on the right, here I have the decay data that we have available to us. This is in particular NuBase 2016, as compared to the R process path in red. Okay, this is an example path at a snapshot in time from this particular simulation, which was particularly neutron rich. All right, so you can see that we have data, yes, but we are still going outside of this data and into neutron-rich regions that have yet to be probed by experiment. So this is going to introduce some uncertainty into our process calculations, and it's also just going to highlight the need for us to work with theorists and experimentalists to put the R process on a more firm footing. Okay, so first, let's just discuss experiment a little bit. You're going to hear more about this from Artemis later in the week, but there are just worldwide experimental campaigns in order to measure the properties of neutron-rich nuclei of relevance for the R process. And some of them are listed here, and some of the nuclei that they've probed or will probe, hopefully, are also shown here. Okay, and then I've just highlighted a few experiments here. My apologies if you're an experimentalist and I didn't show, or a theorist, and I didn't show your favorite experiment here. There's just this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's exciting that there are these worldwide efforts. And like I said, Artemis will have more details about this later in the week. So here is just to demonstrate more explicitly that we're coming up on pretty exciting times with new reaches into the neutron-rich regions taking place at multiple different places within the world. So this is just an example here of the FRIB reach, that is the nuclei that they will be able to synthesize at FRIB. So this is what they could produce, is the way that I should say it, at FRIB in the blue line here. So this still, it remains to be determined what they will probe. There has to be dedicated experimentalists that take those produced nuclei and go out and actually do some measurements on them. And these are challenging measurements, but nevertheless, it's really exciting that they will get this far out. And that's compared directly to what we currently know with that NuBase picture that I showed you before. Now, this movie is going to show the R process path evolve as a function of time. You guys have seen some of these movies now, so you know that these are the abundances up top, and we're going to watch how they evolve as a function of time and compare to where we are within the NZ plane to see how close future experiment is getting to the R process path more explicitly. So I should note that these are moderately neutron-rich conditions, so they don't get as close to this drip line as some of those conditions that we saw that were very neutron-rich, like you can find within dynamical ejecta from mergers. Okay, so let's go ahead and play this video. Here we go. There's the R process path early outside of future experimental reach. Our abundances are dominated by an odd-even effect here. We're starting to go back towards stability. You can see explicitly how much shaping of the abundances is happening now within this region that could be probed by future experiment. So let's take a look at, again, I'm going to go back and let's look at the rare earth peak region. You see how much shaping is happening here. So these future experiments are going to shed light on what's happening in the rare earth peak. Remember, I mentioned that way early in the first part as kind of a mystery as to where this enhancement in abundances is coming from. Another interesting thing is the third peak. So let's take a look at the third peak evolution. I want to go back even further, actually, for the third peak. You can see how in some calculations, we have this shifting and narrowing of the third peak at these times when we're within this region. And that is something that relative to solar is just not lining up. So this is another curious feature that we've noticed in our process calculations, and it would be great if the experiment could come into this region and shed some light as to the reactions and beta decays and masses and things like this in order to refine our calculations. Okay, but you saw that even in that case, we're still going to be going outside of what is experimentally probable. So we're heavily reliant on theory within our process calculations. So you could look at this as introducing some uncertainty, but you could also look at this as an opportunity to probe yes, so far unknown neutron-rich properties of nuclei by comparing to observations. So we're going to try to take a look at that here. But these are the kinds of theory inputs that we need, and that we're excited when theorists do their calculations all the way out to the drip line for us, because there are relatively few available within the literature that approach these very neutron-rich regions. So here we need things like masses, and we need them to be modeled all the way up to the drip line. This demonstrates different drip lines for some different approaches here in the predicted drip line here, the 2-neutron drip line. These are a comparison of some beta decay calculations. This is the D3C is the calculation in this paper here, as compared to this prescription, which is more commonly seen in the literature. And this just shows that you have these rates here being much faster actually up in these regions as compared to down here. So there are some key differences in the beta decay rates of current theory prescriptions that we use that affect our calculations. Neutron capture models. Neutron capture is something that we don't have a whole lot of data for. Neutron capture has primarily been probed like really near stability. So you can see that outlined here for some of these points. And you can see that as a function of neutron number, this is a predicted reaction rate. This is in particular for europium. You can see that different models are giving you different predictions for the reaction rate as much as an order of magnitude or more difference. So there's some progress that needs to be made with neutron capture modeling, beta decay modeling, and the modeling of masses. So what about the R process sensitivity to these different inputs? Well, let's take a look at neutron capture and beta decay. So here on the left, we have some different abundance patterns when you apply different prescriptions of neutron capture. And you can see explicitly different types of features show up, how smooth your abundances are versus how jagged your abundances are. The pink is just a band from taking one of these models and then doing a Monte Carlo where you multiply by a factor of 10 for some values. So this is just giving you a range of what you could get when you vary by as much as a factor of 10. On the right is the results with different beta decay prescriptions, particularly the two that I showed in the last slide, which differ significantly above n equal 126. And you can see, therefore, how different their third peak is. This particular one has a narrow peak, this one has a wider peak, and their predictions for the actinides as well can be markedly different. So this just highlights the need to consider different models when you run your R process calculations, and also the need to make progress in the future. So making progress in the future requires a knowledge of, okay, where do we look? So, I mean, there's a lot of nuclei that the R process synthesize. Are all of them really influencing your calculation? What's influencing it the most? Where do we start? So that's where things like sensitivity studies have come in and been pretty helpful to the community. This is the F value, which essentially tells you how much your baseline abundance changes when you change the reaction rate for that particular nucleus, or when you change the half-life for that particular nucleus. So things like this are very helpful to experimentalists, to theorists, to get an idea of where should we calculate or where should we measure to make an impact on the R process. So I would like to have a spotlight on nuclear masses. We just talked about beta decay. We just talked about neutron capture needs. But masses are a particularly important input in the R process because they determine your capture rates. They determine your decay rates. They should go into those calculations. So these are just some of those definitions that we saw before. One neutron separation energy is dependent upon your nuclear masses. And we know from before that this determines your photodissociation rate from that Saha equation. Also, neutron capture rates depend on separation energy. Beta decay rates depend on your beta decay Q value. So for beta minus, that's going to be the mass of your parent nucleus minus the mass of your daughter nucleus. So you can see explicitly that the masses are an important quantity within your calculations. And here shows for europium how different mass predictions can be as you go away from established data. So this is experimental data. This is extrapolated data, and these are the calculations. They generally agree-ish near the data, but then they just begin to diverge by huge amounts once we get out into the neutron-rich regions. Okay. But I want to go back to the fact that your capture rates and your decay rates are depending upon masses. So something that's important is that our process calculations should be using data sets which are self-consistent and assume the same masses. You would think, oh, of course, potentially, if you're a novice to these R process needs, of course they would. Why wouldn't they? Well, we don't have a lot of data in the neutron-rich regions sometimes. Sometimes you have, been given a beta decay set that's been pre-calculated for you with a given mass input, and a neutron capture set that's been pre-calculated with a given mass input, and they're not the same. So this is something that's important to move forward in a self-consistent way. And something that you should be cautious of and aware of if you ever run your own R process calculations. So now we've talked about a spotlight on nuclear masses, but let's take a look at the impact of nuclear masses on abundances. So this is for a weak R process if we vary by 10 mass models for 2 different types of conditions. This is a strong R process. So the take-home message from this comparison here is that your bands are smaller for the weak R process than the strong R process. There's just more data there. So it's to demonstrate when experiment gets in there and gives us some information to put in our calculations, we can really start to refine our predictions of abundances. And there's a lot of needs that we need in the main R process region to be able to do the same in narrowing these bands. Okay, quickly, I just want to, again, I've mentioned this a few times, I've highlighted it a few times throughout these discussions, but it's something of particular interest to me, and that is the rare earth peak. So this little feature here in the solar data that is seen, it's this bump. As you may recall, these peaks, this is the second R process peak, and that's the third R process peak, are well established to be connected to the N equal 82 and N equal 126 shell closures. But this peak, it's unclear why there's this little enhancement here. Is there a more subtle nuclear structure feature that's producing an extra region, a region that's particularly stable relative to its neighbors and giving you this feature within your solar abundances? It's a mystery. So this is something that's been looked at for well over 15 years. And here you can see up top, this is a particular model. This is sometimes referred to as Ephrodium 1995, where the separation energy contours, where these are important for your calculations, particularly with a hot R process, because of how that separation energy enters your N gamma gamma N equilibrium equations, your Saha equations, you tend to just lie along contours of constant separation energy. So you can see that there's this kink right here. These are your shell closures at n equal 82 and n equal 126. But for this particular model in this region, there's this little kink that will be able to pile up material for you. So here is a study where that kink is wiped away and you get no kink and you get no rare earth peak. And then if you introduce the kink, you can get your abundances to be enhanced in that region. So this could be hinting at some form of nuclear structure that's responsible for this peak. So there's recent calculations of masses from density functional theory are shown here as compared to, this is the updated FRDM, it's a type of droplet model. It's called the finite range droplet model. So this calculation, the updated version of this model, you really just don't see any features in this region anymore. This is showing the quadrupole deformation in this region. But density functional theories were showing some form of deformation. You can make the nucleus especially stable in this region if it's deformed potentially. So this could be hinting at what's going on with the rare earth peak. And a recent work took a look at this, where they took a look at more explicitly a coupling constant, the isovector surface coupling constant here, that's not well constrained by data within a density functional theory mass model. And they adjusted it and saw, where is the weighted average of the rare earth peak? Is this affecting rare earth peak structure? And yes, they did see a relationship here. So these are all hints that there's some kind of structure in the rare earth region responsible for that rare earth peak. And it's going to show up in your masses, that structure goes through to your masses. So what we've done in recent works is to actually try to go backwards. Can we take abundances and map back to the masses that are potentially needed in order to form this peak? So this is what we did for a calculation. We did Markoy Chain Monte Carlo, where you take and you adjust your masses, you compare to the abundances, and then you go back to adjusting your masses, and then you just proceed in this way. So we also applied this to distinct types of outflows. So you guys have now been taught about a hot R process and a cold R process. How about we ignore the green for now and just look at the blue and red, because those are exactly the conditions that I taught you about before, being a hot and a cold R process. So these are what we get when we apply 50 Markoy Chain Monte Carlo calculations and we take the statistics here. These are our predicted masses. This is a mass difference with respect to a particular model that just doesn't have any features in the rare earths. So you can see that for the hot R process here, we're able to get predictions that make a peak where there was no peak before, that match the current data. These data were gone out and independently measured by our collaborators at the CPT at Caribou at Argonne National Lab, where our calculation was only aware of these AME values. And this is what's currently matching data. The cold is just not, it's able to give you a peak, but using masses that are not really consistent with current data. However, I just want to highlight here that the main features that are forming the peak for these types of calculations are really in this region, things like 104, things like 108. So we're just beyond what experiment has probed, and there will be interesting discussions of understanding the rare earth peak in the future when experiments come online. Okay, so another thing that can influence, so that rare earth region is the lanthanides. So we had some discussion of lanthanides earlier and how important they are for understanding the kilonova, but there's more mysteries surrounding the lanthanides than just the rare earth peak. So I wanted to highlight this so-called robustness that is sometimes talked about within our process observations. This is 10 R process rich halo stars as compared to solar. Solar is in blue. These have just been scaled up and down so that you can see it more clearly. And what you see is that particularly in the lanthanides, these abundances are very consistent. So this is just a mystery. What is causing this? Why are these abundances so consistent? Well, for more than, I would say, the last 15 or 10 years, people have been looking at if fission could be a possible explanation for this. This is a snapshot from that movie that we've seen where you go up, you push all of your synthesis pushes the populations that you have up into the actinide regions, and then you deposit back down. So in this sense, fission is what's primarily responsible for the final abundance structure, such that it can wash away any kind of dependence that you had on your initial condition. So this is the thought that maybe this is a signature of what we call fission cycling. So this is a work down here that talked about this robustness, where it took a look at neutron star mergers of different masses, and it took a look at neutron star black hole mergers as well. And it was finding, this work found that roughly the same abundances are achieved for all of these cases because they're particularly neutron rich and they all fission. So just a word of caution here, this is a really interesting hint, but we should keep in mind that all of these are very similarly neutron rich, and there's a lot of unknowns in the fissioning regions. So let's talk about the fissioning regions, what we know, what we don't know, how it's affecting our R process calculations. So to understand fission in the R process, we need to understand fission a little bit here. So what we have is we have an incident neutron strike, or some way to get the nucleus excited, and then it's going to deform. Then it's going to break. Then it can, these fragments that it breaks into can be excited, and they're going to emit neutrons, they're going to emit gammas, they're going to do things in order to expel that extra energy that they have in order to get to a more stable state. There can also be beta delayed emission after beta decay of the neutron-rich products, okay? So let's first take a look at how the nucleus splits and how that impacts our R process calculations, our process predictions. So I know that this slide is a little bit busy, but I'm just going to walk you through it. Essentially, these are three different types of yields that I want to highlight, three different groups that look at three different types of yields. The yields, or how the nucleus is splitting, are portrayed up top, okay, for all of these. And then in the bottom, you see the corresponding abundances of these calculations. So these are the SPY yields, where some of them have these 4 peaked structures. So when you look at a fission yield, what this is a probability that you have a particular daughter product, basically fission product. So for example, when they're bimodal like this, you have to have this product and that product together. Or if you have something in the middle, say that you have something like this that we call symmetric, this is asymmetric, that's symmetric, then you just have two that are of equal mass that are splitting. So you always have two products, it's just the way that it splits. So when you look at these 4, you're really looking at something like this and this being produced together versus this and this being produced together, okay? All right, so you see that this type of distribution for some key nuclei for this particular work saw that they could maybe fill in the rare earth peak here. So potentially this is an explanation for the rare earth peak bump that we see in the solar data. These are 2 different prescriptions and their relative abundances as well. You can see explicitly these Kodama and Takahashi's are very wide and broad, and so they tend to do this within a calculation. If you get to know these yields, you can like look at an abundance, a predicted abundance, and just like see like, oh, okay, they used 50-50 or they used Kodama and Takahashi, etc. Here, they saw very, very wide yields, and they also had their R process going to very, very high mass numbers, which ended up washing away their second peak, which is really interesting. They just got very flat abundances that washed away their second peak. Whereas when they instead enforced, okay, you can't go very high, we're just going to terminate you, you're not going to be able to proceed to very, very heavy regions, they got a totally different structure. So one way to visualize that is that your yields are changing as a function of neutron number. It's not like every single yield is asymmetric or every single yield is symmetric, okay? You have yield trends in the NZ plane that you have to take into account. Another thing that we did in a recent work was to take into account that different processes have different excitation energies. So we already saw neutron-induced, beta-delayed, spontaneous fission playing a role in our calculations, and all of those have a distinct excitation energy dependence. So you can see explicitly here, the blue are the yields for spontaneous fission, and the red are the yields for neutron-induced fission. So you get these increased asymmetries with neutron-induced fission in these neutron-rich regions from this particular model. That's what this particular model predicts. And these are our results as compared to that broad Kodama and Takahashi. We get something that's much more well-distributed with respect to the second peak. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about how the R process goes up and terminates because of fission, or like how far it really goes. So what is the ultimate reach of the R process? Well, that is unclear in these very neutron-rich regions, and it very much depends on something called the fission barriers, which is schematically outlined here. So the fission barrier is essentially the minimum energy that you need before it's going to be most probable to just fission, for this nucleus to just break. It's going to be more energetically favorable for the nucleus to just break in half, okay? So lower barriers, you're going to very likely, you're more likely to fission. But specifically, if you want to use these barriers to actually get a feeling for your spontaneous fission probability, your beta-delayed fission probability, neutron-induced fission probability, it's not just the barrier that matters. It's going to be for beta-delayed, it's the barrier minus the Q value. For neutron-induced, it's the barrier minus spontaneous, where ignore the red in these plots, it's just like abundances at a given time. But here you can see explicitly, if you're smaller, you have a larger fission probability in general for each of these channels, okay? So again, I just want to highlight those definitions, those things we talked about earlier, Q values, separation energies, they're coming back into your calculations to play a role in calculating your rates, as we mentioned earlier. So these are two different models for the fission barriers shown here. And this translates into different reaches for the R process. So this is for HFB, a model called HFB, and this is a model called BCPM. So HFB is known to have a region where you can kind of sneak past any low barriers and get up into these very high mass number regions, as is seen here. Whereas something like this model, you're going to be stopped pretty quickly by a low barrier region around n equal 184, that predicted shell closure that we talked about before, okay? So fission is determining the ultimate reach of the R process, but it's in regions where we don't know much. Okay, so something that's been discussed is, could the R process produce super heavy elements? And again, this is linked to the barriers. This is why I decided to talk about this just after the barriers, because you have to go through, you have to first make all of the species, but then during your decay back, you have to not destroy all of those species. So super heavy elements in general have Z greater than 103, and they've been produced in laboratories, as you can see in this plot. Additionally, some models predict a so-called island of stability at Z is 114 and N equal 184, where if you make these species, they could be particularly stable and therefore particularly long-lived. So if we ever saw these super heavy elements in nature, they've only been produced in laboratories, but if we ever saw them in nature, we would have to know that what we think for fission barriers needs to be adjusted, because current predictions, have the R process make the nuclei, and then they just get, they fission away along this beta decay path before they can actually reach this region, as is explicitly demonstrated here. This is an earlier time and this is a later time, okay? But we don't know what's going on in these fissioning regions. It would be very, very useful for experimentalists to get up here and start probing even stuff kind of close to what they've measured to try to inform these calculations a little bit more. There could be some kind of pathway where these low barrier regions actually break and then things can sneak their way through and alpha decay down, as was discussed in this paper. So a lot of open questions as to the actual reach of the R process in very, very neutron-rich conditions where it can get up into the actinides to begin with. Okay, so we're going to put together for this, we're going to put together this discussion of fission yield importance and fission rate importance, fission barrier importance, because in a recent work, we took a look at calculations for fission yields that are self-consistent with the fission barriers that were used for rate. So the same fission barriers were used in calculating the yields and the rates. So these particular yields see very wide ranges of nuclei at which they deposit, as is shown here. At earlier times, when you're populating a species like this, you're very wide, and even at intermediate times and later times. So you're just flattening your abundances, as can be seen here, sort of like we saw in an earlier plot where that second peak had almost completely gone away. Here we don't have the second peak go away, but nevertheless, we see a very broad distribution of abundances. So this is with this current model as compared to if you just split the nucleus in half. Now, this can get back to this discussion of robustness. These stars here are the stars that we saw on that earlier plot as compared to our predictions. So you can see that this range here, which is determined from a range of dynamical ejecta conditions, everything's very neutron rich and gets to the fissioning regions, but the way that the density falls off, et cetera, is distinct between all of these. And therefore you can get, for something like a 50-50 distribution, a pretty broad, wide band that's not entirely consistent with what we see with these abundances being right on in the lanthanide region. Additionally, we were seeing for the first time some population of species down here for silver and palladium. So that's also interesting. If you take a look at silver and palladium, potentially they have some kind of connection to this robustness for very, very R process enhanced stars, things like R2 and R1 stars. So this is an interesting consideration. This is an example of how you're trying to interpret, okay, does this come from fission? But your models are influencing those conclusions. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about this energy release from fission, because interesting things can happen here. Something like a 200 MeV-Q value from fission. So Californium-254 is a species that is particularly long-lived for something that, well, not super long-lived, but it's not on the order of microseconds or milliseconds. It's actually on the order of days. And this is interesting in an astrophysical context because your light curves, as we saw from that example of supernova 1987A, are influenced by the decay timescales of species that are present. So our pioneers in the field of nuclear astrophysics, this is Margaret Burbidge, this is her husband, Jeffrey Burbidge, they had noticed this a long time ago, that when Californium-254 was first produced, this thing has a 60-day half-life about. So could it be showing up in supernova light curves? Well, what you see here is what we think all of these different nucleosynthesis processes, the reach of all these different nucleosynthesis processes that are currently studied in the literature. And the R process is really the only one that we think could get to this region. As we discussed earlier, supernova are not really an R process candidate these days. but neutron star mergers are. So do we see any maybe hints of californium for neutron star mergers? Does a neutron star merger reach the actinides? Our calculations, some of them say so, but what does observation say? Can we compare to observations to see if we actually get to the actinides and mergers? So what we did was to actually see, we have a model that does predict californium to be populated. And there is a very distinct influence from californium at around 100 days. You can see explicitly here that if it's produced, you have this bump, as to if you don't have this at all within your calculation, if you just take spontaneous fission out of your calculation. When you translate this to a light curve, this is giving you that it's the difference between detection and no detection with the James Webb Space Telescope. So it could influence your late time light curves and tell you something about whether or not the merger that you're looking at in real time made actinides. Okay, but of course, this section is all about how the nuclear model is going to influence that interpretation. So different abundance predictions affect the nuclear heating that goes into calculating light curves in the bolometric luminosity, and it can also affect your inferred ejecta mass by roughly an order of magnitude or more. So this can be seen explicitly here. This is the heating rate as a function of time. And these are models up here that strongly populate long-lived actinides, something like californium-254. But this is a model that doesn't. So you see explicitly the uncertainty in your predictions that you're getting from this, and also just the influence that the nuclear physics can have within your calculations. So what we see here is we take a couple of different models and a couple of different YE values for different neutron richness, and we calculate explicitly the light curve prediction. Now, there was a previous slide that showed how the mass ejection that you assume from an event really influences your kilonova light curve, okay? So what was done here was to do calculations with these models at many different ejecta masses, and then see which one of these most closely matches the GW 1708-17 data. So you can see that you're gonna vary what you think of the ejecta mass from that particular event depending upon your model. Another possible signature of fission, so californium-254 and its bump in the light curve, that's not the only way. The bump in the light curve is not the only way to maybe see that there was fission. So MEV gamma rays are also another really interesting way. So this is the diagram that we saw before, where you have something called prompt emission and delayed emission, okay, of different gamma rays. So the interesting thing is that prompt emission and delayed emission can have energies that are much higher than what you would typically get for your R process species at late times. At late times, you tend to be decaying back to stability, things with like less high Q values than you had at earlier times in your calculations. So something like this is the energy range that you expect for gammas from just a beta decaying species within the R process. But fissioning species, this is the fission spectrum predicted by models that we applied along compared to some experimental data here, see much higher energies. So above something like 3.5 MeV, your gammas are coming from fission and nothing else, okay? So this means that if something like AMIGO, which is a telescope that looks for MEV gamma rays, were to see a signal from a galactic neutron star merger that's above its threshold here, this is a case where we have fission and we have reached those regions, we have reached the fissioning species, then you have, as a function of energy, this signal up here that you don't have in the event that you don't reach the actinides. So this is another interesting way that you could determine whether or not you had fission in a neutron star merger. Okay, so let's get back to our solar system. We talked a lot about neutron star mergers and GW 1708-17, but we still have really interesting hints at actinide production, at just the origins of the elements within our solar system coming from meteorites. So I mentioned Curious Marie in the very beginning. Let's take a closer look at Curious Marie and the nature of the last star process event within our solar system. So if we want to look at the last event that polluted the solar system, we're going to want to look at things with half-lives that are less than a gigayear, things that on the order of megayear or so, that would have to decay away. So there's only 4 of these, okay? It's interesting because if you take a look at the 4, there's 2 of the 4 that basically have almost the same exact half-life. So this is just a curious fact, but also it's incredibly important for the R process, it turns out. And that goes back to these arguments of galactic chemical evolution. So you can see for something that's stable relative to something that's not, you have an injection of elements and then a decay, an injection of elements and then a decay, where these are going to be very different. If you look at one point in time about this particular ratio, it's going to be different as a function of time because your decay time scales are very, very different, etc. But with these 2 species having the same half-life, you have that their ratio is basically preserved. So it doesn't change as a function of time because if they're produced in the same event, they're just decaying in the same way. Therefore, their production ratio, what they're actually produced as within an event, will stay the same as you move forward in time and as you evaluate this. So you can peer directly into the last event that enriched the solar system. So what we did was to do some calculations. More specifically here, this was Marius Eichler with WinNet. I mentioned this was one of the nucleosynthesis networks earlier, where Marius did all of these variations of different mass models, different fission yields, because one of these is an actinide and one of these is a fission product. So we really have to consider different mass models and different fission prescriptions. So these are the ranges that you get for different types of conditions. We considered dynamical ejecta, neutron star black hole, a different simulation of neutron star mergers, disk ejecta, and magnetorotationally driven supernovae, those MHD supernovae from before. So you can see that these particular conditions, these are all very, very neutron rich. All of these simulations saw this type of ejecta to be neutron rich, maybe a little more neutron rich than some more modern simulations, but nevertheless, very neutron rich ejecta is just not matching what they see within meteorites. It's moderately neutron rich ejecta that is really more consistent with what they're seeing within meteorites. And just because we're in the nuclear physics section, I'm going to mention this real quickly before we stop. This paper, this was a science paper that we put out recently. We went through the painstaking job of doing a lot of nuclear physics calculations to ensure that these predictions were robust within the face of nuclear physics. It's interesting that we did find a model which produces lower actinides. Actually, it's one that uses those beta decay rates that we discussed earlier, the D3C star ones that tend to have lower actinides. And it is matching, it is capable of matching, but by and large, your nuclear physics models are predicting for this very neutron-rich ejecta to be inconsistent. So it's pointing to the last event that enriched the solar system to be moderately neutron-rich. So that's interesting. Okay, and then I just wanted to wrap up by saying to everyone that we have these really interesting ways of putting all of this together. As somebody who recently was applying for jobs you have to apply for jobs within nuclear physics and apply for jobs in astrophysics programs. And people in these programs tend to be looking more at this connection. We're learning about nuclear properties from experiment and fundamental theory, and that's excellent. These two go back and forth, and they teach us things throughout the nuclear chart. Additionally, over here in the astrophysics, people are working hard on understanding astrophysical sites with these simulations and what that means for observation and to understand galactic origins. But what the spirit of something like NIC really is, and something like JINA, if you're familiar with it, really is that putting all of these together is where the power lies. So once you put together our understanding of nuclear properties with our understanding of astrophysical sites, like we do with nucleosynthesis calculations, you're able to not only inform the astrophysics better, but you're able to allow astrophysics to inform theory. And just a quick example is, remember with that fission, if we saw californium, we would know that the barriers have to be enough or such a way that you can allow for it to be produced. So there are things that are able to teach you about the nuclear physics from the astrophysics. So all of this needs to be working together. So it's an exciting era of multi-messenger nuclear astrophysics. And if you're a young person that's interested in this, just keep this in mind when you're going after these positions in the future, that this is what you're advocating for, that this is the field that puts it all together and puts it all in the big context. Okay. All right. Well, this has been very, very nice for me to share all of this with you, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. I'm looking forward to meeting you all during the discussions. Bye-bye.